Hi, this is Jeff Blauette, technical agronomist with Cooperative Farmers Elevator. And on this week's Field Friday segment, I wanted to kind of talk about the soybean flowering that's just starting to happen out in these fields. We're out here in our soybean population and planting date trial. So we've got a couple things that can, show you the differences in what planting date can do and development, and it should be interesting to see what harvest shows us this fall. But we talked about last week in our Field Friday segment on the herbicide timing. Once we get to R1 with basically a flower somewhere on the plant, a lot of herbicides basically are starting to become off-label, and we've kind of got to be done by then. With as much early planting as we had this year, we had probably more beans get planted in April than we've ever had before. Things were really kind of wrapping up as we got closer to the 10th of May, which is quite early. We can see some further development on things. Flowers hitting us a little bit earlier than normal, and that kind of closes that herbicide window a little bit earlier than normal. So let's take a look at what this difference makes when it comes to planting date. First off, for eons we've all been taught that soybeans are a daylight sensitive crop. Flowering is initiated once we get to the summer solstice, which is June 21st, and our nights start getting a little longer. But as we've gotten more interest and more emphasis on this earlier planting, what we've kind of learned when we push that earlier into the planting window, that we can get flowers before the days start getting shorter, and that kind of flies in the face of what historically we've been taught with soybeans. So I think what it does tell us is, I do think there's still a component where these soybeans really start to rapidly ramp up towards flowering if they aren't already once we do start getting shorter days. But these earlier planted beans, we've had beans flower, several days or even a week before June 21st, especially for some earlier maturing soybeans. So that's kind of telling us that it can be manipulated by planting date. I've got a couple of examples here. This is the same bean. This was a 2.1 maturity soybean. If we look at the difference in development here, this first soybean is basically at V6 to V7 before it started to flower. You can see there's some flowers on here. They've been here for a few days. This was the early planting date. So in this plot this year, we planted the early planting stuff April 20th. And so if we look at that date and how far along these beans are, these were flowered probably about a week ago. You could start to see a few flowers show up in this plot on those early planted strips. So you can tell there's a pretty good development on this plant with 7 trifoliates already. That's above normal before flowering initiates. A lot of times I think we're probably more normally is probably 4 or 5 trifoliates before we start initiating flowering. A lot of years it's hard to find flowers until the 1st of July, that first week of July, but I think we're going to have a large percentage of beans flowered by the 1st of July this year, which is obviously different. But then if we look at the later planting plant here, again the same bean planted May 13, you can see it's got a couple less trifoliates. It's not flowering yet, so that's basically no difference other than planting date. So we can manipulate when those plants flower by that, and this proves that. The other thing let's look at, I'll look at them side by side. The development on these beans, you can see the nodule development on the roots that I dug up. You can see the one on the left has developed more larger nodules, probably a few more. That was the earlier planting root, and then the one on the right is the later planted. Same bean, both had Preside inoculant applied to them as a seed treatment. So you can kind of see that development there is further as well. That should bode well when it comes to yield. I think all of our beans are set up to really yield well. Even this May 13, that's not really late planting. I think we're set up to have some pretty nice potential with the plant development and the amount of nodes. The amount of nodes basically, obviously it's where all the the flowers initiate from, so the more nodes, the more places we have to put pods, and that should help us in yield. And we'll see if that bears its way out this fall, but that's kind of the concept of the earlier planting, is to get more nodes out here and get a better chance to add some yield on the top end. So I just thought we'd touch on that. We have this myth of soybeans being entirely daylight sensitive. That's not entirely true. It's only partially true. And why we talk about early planting and why we're testing it is I think it's showing us here we've got some potential for some added yield here. So we'll see what harvest tells us, I guess, and that'll kind of be the answer to the question a little bit. So, but with that, that's this week's Field Friday segment, and we'll see you next week.